My name is Alex Cooley. I'm a Kim's colleague at Barnard College, professor of political science, and direct the Harriman Institute here. And I have the great pleasure and privilege to moderate the panel looking ahead. Is U.S. Russia cooperation possible? The burning question of the moment. And we have three world-class experts here who are going to help us navigate these big issue ideas and big issue debates. So let's just proceed in the order of the program. So first we have Dr. Sergey Rogov, Director of the Institute of U.S. and Canadian Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences.
Thank you, Alex. Let me start with a disclaimer. I'm no more Director of the Institute of the U.S. and Canadian Studies. I'm научный руководитель of the Institute of U.S. and Canada Studies. Well, I don't know how to translate this in English.
Scientific director.
Academic director.
Academic director. Okay.
I also have to apologize. I don't feel well, but I'm very happy to be here, and it's a great pleasure and honor for me. And I have to confess that I first came to the Columbia University in 1972, when I was a postgraduate student at the Institute and assigned to the Soviet mission to the United Nations. And that's, so I'm starting by looking back, not looking forward. And that's how I met Marshall Schulman, Bob Legwelt, and quite a few other friends from whom I learned a lot. Really, that was an enormous opportunity for me to understand more what's happening in Russian-American relations. By the way, in 1996, I happened to be the only Russian at the 80th anniversary of Marshall. And he still was driving on the motorcycle. Amazing, amazing man. In 1972, there were reasons for optimism. It was the time of detente. The SALT agreement and the ABM treaty were signed, and we were looking for a major improvement of the Soviet-American relations and the end of the Cold War. It didn't happen. The Cold War ended 20 years later. And then the perception was, and I shared this perception, that there are no objective reasons for rivalry between Russia and the United States. And there are good opportunities for us to cooperate. When I look at the situation today, it's very difficult for me to be optimistic. I consider that we are in a new Cold War. Many people object against this term. Okay, the new confrontation between Russia and the United States is consolidated and institutionalized. We can call it, I call it Cold War 2.0. We can invent some other label, but the relationship is pretty nasty. And there are major differences, of course, with the original Cold War. There is no ideological conflict between Russia and the United States. Whatever is the ideology in Russia today, it's not communism, and the dominant trend is nationalism, all kind of conservative views. And when I look at the Trump's electorate, I don't see much of a difference between this right-wing populist shift in Russia and the right-wing populist shift in the United States or in many European countries. We can, of course, discuss what it means, but my point is that it's not what it was during the original Cold War in the ideological area. The second major difference is that there is no global competition between two social and economic systems. Whatever is the new confrontation, it's the confrontation between Russia and the United States, Russia and American allies, but it's not a global conflict since many major international players are not participating in this Cold War 2.0. And of course, the international system itself, it's no more bipolar. It's a multipolar system with the United States still being number one, but China is growing, other players are growing, and Russia is not a superpower. But Russia is trying to maintain its place among the club of major powers in the international community in the 21st century. Still, why I'm using the term Cold War 2.0? Because there are many instruments of the original Cold War which are actively used today. First of all, it's outrageous propaganda. In this country and in Russia, the stereotypes of the Cold War time are back. It's demonizing the other guy. And what is in particular worrisome is that propaganda has replaced serious analysis and is used as a substitute for a strategy. And some political leaders believe their own propaganda, and you know that's very dangerous. The second, and I'll talk more about it, but let me mention other instruments of the Cold War which are quite active. Instead of economic integration of Russia in the global community, the United States and the American allies are trying to hurt Russia economically, to create as many problems for Russia as it is possible. It's enough to mention sanctions, and I believe more is coming. But definitely, the economic relationship, which was not, which never was a pillar of the Russian-American cooperation, today is the area of the economic warfare. Mostly one-sided, since Russia hardly can hurt the United States economically. We shall see what China can do, but that's not the topic I'm supposed to discuss. The third feature is almost complete lack of a normal political dialogue. The mechanisms which are necessary for such dialogue have been either frozen or cancelled. Yes, from time to time, Lavrov met Tillerson. I don't know when he is going to meet Pompeo, and I'm not sure it's going to be Lavrov who is going to meet Pompeo, since there will be some changes in the Russian government too. But Russia-NATO Council, or remember, Russian-American Presidential Commission with all its working groups, they're practically dead. And finally, and that is the most dangerous development, the new arms race, enormous military tension, and there is a serious threat of an accidental war which can escalate into nuclear war. It's very difficult to think about such scenario as a real possibility, but let me mention just one example. When last year NATO fighters intercepted the aircraft of Russian Defense Minister Shoigu when he was flying from St. Petersburg to Kaliningrad. And only when a Russian military aircraft made some threatening maneuvers, the NATO fighters went out. Just imagine what would have happened if Russian fighters intercepted the aircraft of General Mattis flying to Alaska. And the arms control regime is on the verge of a total collapse. I still believe there is a small window of opportunity, but the appointment of my good old friend John Bolton maybe is a self-fulfilling prediction. Because, well, I frankly don't see who in the Trump administration is interested or capable of conducting arms control negotiations. And that means that we have the arms race and the military competition without any rules of the game. Not yet. The INF Treaty is still existent, although I'm afraid it will collapse in next year. And the START Treaty is still alive. But if the INF Treaty collapses, it's very unlikely that the START Treaty will survive in a vacuum. And since the ABM Treaty is gone, the CFE Treaty, Conventional Forces in Europe, is gone, the CTBT apparently will never be ratified by the United States. Not only in my lifetime, but in my grandchildren's lifetime. I cannot imagine the US Senate ratifying any new arms control treaty, legally binding obligations. Please tell me if I'm wrong. I would be happy to be wrong, but I'm afraid any new arms control treaty is totally impossible. Now about, well, propaganda and fake news and fake scenarios, how much damage they're doing. We heard at the morning session Matthew was speaking about the Russian doctrine of escalate to de-escalate. It's complete fake. It does not exist. Listening to that panel, I wanted to intervene since I'm apparently the only participant at this conference who was engaged in Russian internal discussions of Russian national security strategy and Russian defense doctrine. I'm still the chairman of the International Security Advisory Board to the Russian National Security Council. And I can assure you that all kinds of strange ideas were expressed when internal discussions took place. But never the term escalate to de-escalate was used in the drafts of the Russian national security strategy. And that is, I think, very important because, well, the fake perception of Russian willingness to initiate the use of nuclear weapons, or even conduct a preemptive strike. And I must confess that there was some discussion of preemptive strikes, and that approach was completely rejected. although at some point Mr. Patrushev in one of his public interviews mentioned it. But it didn't go into the official doctrine. So what is Russian nuclear doctrine? Much attention was paid to Putin's speech to the Federal Parliament of Russia on March 1st. But he also gave, and that's very unusual, 3 very lengthy TV interviews. And there he repeated in a very forceful way Russian conditions for use of nuclear weapons. And honestly, looking at American publications since then, I haven't noticed, please correct me if I'm wrong, but not a single American expert paid attention to what he said. And he emphasized that Russia is relying on the doctrine of ответно-встречный удар. I'm using the Russian term ответно-встречный удар because quite often it's forgotten that Russian thinking and American thinking about nuclear weapons and military affairs is not identical. What is ответно-встречный удар? In America, people speak about launch on warning or launch under attack. Ответно-встречный удар is neither. And actually, it's not easy to translate the term into English. The first part of the term ответный means retaliatory. But встречный means simultaneous. And встречный comes from the military terminology when 2 marching armies attacked each other. So it was a situation when there is no defender and no attacker, but both sides attack. So ответно-встречный удар means that Russia is not going to be the first. But does it mean that Russia is going to be the second? Because встречный, simultaneous, doesn't mean to be the second. And Putin, for the first time ever, no Soviet or Russian leader openly discussed what it means, describing how Russia is going to respond. He said that we shall launch our nuclear weapons when we will see the launch of strategic missiles of the other guy. He didn't mention, didn't describe who is the other guy, but we all know who is the other guy. When we shall see how many missiles are launched, and when we precisely define the trajectory of the missiles. And then we shall launch before they hit the targets. This is how Russia is planning to respond to the perceived American preemptive strike. And speaking about the fake scenarios, there is definitely a fake scenario of a Russian attack and occupation of the Baltic states. It's a complete fake. But in the last 2 or 3 years, it has been taken as a basis for NATO military response to Russia. Russia has its own fake story. We are preoccupied with the NATO attack on Kaliningrad. And since it's extremely difficult to Russia, for obvious geographic reasons, to defend Kaliningrad, the issue of the use of tactical nuclear weapons is sometimes mentioned. And Russian declaratory doctrine, Russian national security strategy, speaks about 2 scenarios when nuclear weapons could be used by Russia. One is when Russia is attacked by nuclear weapons, and another when Russia is attacked by conventional forces, as a result of which the very existence of the Russian state is threatened. I urge you to pay attention to terminology, because, well, just Matthew said this morning that he doesn't read Russian, doesn't speak Russian. Matthew, it's very difficult to analyze Russian debates and Russian positions using only secondary sources, which quite often are bad translations and quite often are representing the irrelevant information by some articles by some obscure retired colonels in a newspaper or journal. Olga, who speaks Russian, today, this morning, spoke about existential threat. It's not the existential threat, Olga, it's the threat to existence of the Russian state, which is not existential threat. That means really an invasion. It's not permanent. It's not permanent. But what our military and political players mean is an invasion, conventional invasion into Russia. And since the conventional balance today between Russia and NATO is so asymmetrical, unlike it was during the Cold War, then the issue of tactical nuclear weapons raised. And James Schlesinger told me 20 years ago, of course, well, Russia is going to do what NATO did in the 60s, when we faced enormous conventional superiority by the Red Army. We deployed thousands of tactical nuclear weapons. In a way, Russia is also doing that, although the scope is much smaller. And what is important is that, well, in those exercises which we conduct regularly, the last one, Zapad 2017, if you look at the open sources, it was very clearly an invasion by NATO into Kaliningrad and Belarus, and Russian counteroffensive. And for the first time, apparently, there was no indication that Russia was using tactical nuclear weapons to stop this invasion. This is something which has to be taken into account, because I mentioned when Shoigu's aircraft was intercepted by Polish F-16s. Shoigu was flying to Kaliningrad for the meeting of the entire leadership of the Russian Defense Ministry, where for the first time he proclaimed that we can rely on conventional deterrence. This is the first time a Russian defense minister used this terminology, and it's not yet included in the doctrinal documents, but apparently Russia will respond to the national security strategy of the Trump administration. And I hope, at least I'm trying to achieve it as much as possible, we should release our own nuclear posture review. Make in one document an elaborated discussion on Russian nuclear weapons. You know, I was supposed to talk about the bright future of Russian-American relations, but instead I'm talking about, well, nuclear warfare scenarios. They most probably will never happen. But nevertheless, we cannot exclude them. If the present trends will continue, Because as a result of the NATO enlargement, the disengagement zone between Russian forces and NATO, which was established in early 90s when Russian troops were withdrawn from Eastern Germany, Poland, and other Eastern European countries and Baltic states, this disengagement zone disappeared. And for the first time, again, not for the first time, but like during the Cold War, Russian and NATO forces today face each other on a daily basis, and all kind of nasty accidents happen. And that's why I consider that it's absolutely necessary for us to revisit and modernize 1972 Agreement on Prevention of Accidents at Sea. Maybe we should also sign Agreement on Prevention of Accidents in the Air. And those should be not bilateral arrangements only, but also between Russia and NATO. And I know all this talk that NATO cannot sign an agreement with a single sovereign country. That's nonsense. If we want to prevent an accident which can lead to military confrontation, we should do it. Secondly, we should do whatever we can as soon as possible. And I was arguing that Putin should propose to Trump to have an immediate nuclear arms summit after the presidential elections in Russia. We have to discuss the INF treaty and save the INF treaty, and we have to discuss how to maintain the START treaty. With the INF treaty, there are Russian complaints and there are NATO complaints. If I have time, I can give you what I consider to be very simple solutions, how to deal with allegations of American violations by Russia and by the United States. Russian allegations are related to the long-range drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, which, if you take the text of the INF Treaty literally, could correspond to the definition of ground-launched cruise missiles. Simply in 1987, nobody thought about long-range drones. And we should negotiate and sign a protocol making clear that unmanned aerial vehicles are not ground-launched cruise missiles. The second Russian complaint is about American use of two stages of ICBMs like MX and Minuteman III for testing American ballistic missile defenses. We say that the United States, in fact, makes thus medium-range missiles, and that is violation of the INF Treaty. Again, the problem could be resolved if we sign a protocol which would make it clear that each side is permitted to have, let's say, each year 5 or 10 tests, whatever is the number we should negotiate, of missiles for testing purposes. And that is not a violation of the INF Treaty, because Russia is also testing Russian missile defenses. Finally, the last and most serious problem is the Aegis Ashore launcher, which, when it's deployed on the ground in Romania and later this year in Poland, becomes a ground-based launcher. We say it's a violation of the INF Treaty, and of course, well, Aegis is a very Aegis launcher is a very versatile system which can launch different types of missiles, defensive like SM-3 or SM-2, or offensive like Tomahawk. And what could be the solution? the United States should agree to physically modify the launcher tubes so only defensive missiles like SM-3 could be put into the tube, but making it impossible to put into the tubes the capsules with Tomahawks or other offensive vehicles. And that should be verified by Russia. Of course, well, a solution like that is reversible. But I want to remind you that Russia agreed in the START Treaty that the United States conventionalize some of its heavy bombers, so they're not counted as strategic bombers anymore, by cutting off some of the equipment which is necessary to carry the nuclear weapons. Of course, it's reversible. It could be done. It could be within several weeks or months. It could be restored. But we accepted it. And if the United States agrees to do it, then Russia should invite the United States to come to Kapustin Yar and inspect the testing of the sea-launched caliber cruise missile, because INF Treaty permits to test on the ground sea-launched cruise missiles. The United States interpreted that as a Russian effort to test ground-based launch missile. Well, these problems, if we don't rely on propaganda, could be released very quickly. And we also should negotiate.
I'm sorry, Sergey, I'm going to have to cut you off soon because we are over time. And so if you could just finish your thoughts and then we can circle back to this.
And if we're able to preserve the INF Treaty, then it will become possible to negotiate prolongation of the INF Treaty for 5 more years. As far as any additional arrangements or deeper reductions, that would require a legally binding agreement which will never be ratified by the US Senate. So today we have the window of opportunity, but maybe yesterday it was closed by Bolton.
Wow, and on that note, thank you very much, Sergey, and also thank you for those very substantive recommendations and ideas. Next on the panel, Fyodor Lukyanov, who is the Editor-in-Chief of Russia and Global Affairs and Chairman of the Presidium of the Russia Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. Fyodor.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Kim, for inviting me. This is extremely interesting conference and fantastic environment and Columbia University. I has been here not as long ago as Professor Rogov, but maybe 12 years ago I was at one event here, and of course atmosphere was slightly different than today. And I'm particularly pleased to listen to introductions at this panel, because I'm a typical product of the post-Cold War development. So which means that I do what I never studied. So I'm here because of profound changes and transformation in my country and in the world. 30 plus years ago, I had no idea that I one beautiful day would appear at such a panel, because I studied philology and linguistics at Moscow State University and wrote my dissertation, thesis, diploma, about theory of translation. And I'm so happy that we are back to linguistics, and we see that how important it is for strategic stability as well. So it's very good. I was instructed by Kim in our email exchange a couple of weeks ago to try not to go into the usual business of Russian perspective, American perspective, and to try to outline something more comprehensive. So I'm not sure I will be able to do it. At the end of the day, I'm Russian, so our perspective or perspectives are sitting pretty deep in mind. But still, I think one of dimensions which was lacking during our previous sessions was that we are too much focused on bilateral issues. We discuss Russia-US or Russia-West, Russia-NATO, as if the rest of the world does not exist or does not play that role as it does in reality. So I think it's not a right approach nowadays, because Russian-US relationship is part of profound transformation of the whole world. Unlike situation 30 or 40 years ago, relationship between Moscow and Washington is not the core of international relations and the international system, although of course still very important part, but it's not anything which defines the rest of international relations as it was the case, say, in 70s or early 80s. So the profound characteristics of world system today, from my point of view, is a multi-layer disbalance. So if we try to put it in terms of realist political theory, which insists that balance of forces, balance of powers is a precondition for peace and stability. So now situation is as bad as possible, because we have this balance not just in strategic issues, not in military affairs, strategic affairs, but on all levels, be it economy, be it humanitarian relationship, and so on. So that's why this phenomenon of asymmetric relationship, asymmetric responses is now becoming the most discussed and most applied, because how the natural wish, natural desire to restore balance cannot be done in normal, traditional ways when you have so many pieces of this balance on all levels, and at each level this balance is different than on the others. So we have different players, we have different capacities, and so on. So this asymmetric approach, or this popular notion of hybrid relationship, hybrid wars, hybrid diplomacy, whatever, this is actually quite understandable, rational, although very dangerous response to this unique situation in the international system. I would dare to say that we are now, between Russia and the United States, we are now in the stage of the real Cold War. It's not a metaphor, as it used to be before pretty recently, until pretty recently, when this notion has been used by journalists and in public discussions, but it was not the real Cold War. Now it is. What I mean by that, I mean the atmosphere. Of course, the usage of this term is misleading, because when we call the current situation a Cold War, then we immediately refer to the Cold War we had in second half of 20th century, which is not instructive, because that Cold War was completely different. But I mean the atmosphere, and the atmosphere of the Cold War before, and I'm afraid now, is very simple. It's not just very bad relationship. It's about agenda, and when we don't have any interest and any incentive, any willingness to agree on anything but to manage confrontation. So if you compare period of the Cold War and period after the Cold War, after the Cold War the main issue discussed, implemented, developed was conflict resolution. And that was new compared to the Cold War, because during the Cold War it was no idea to resolve any conflicts. USA and Soviet Union, they were there not to settle some regional conflicts, for example. all of them were used as testing ground for competition in the situation when big war was impossible because of nuclear deterrence. And these characteristics of the Cold War, that nothing but minimizing risks is actually important to parts, I'm afraid we are moving towards that direction, which means that future of local conflicts we are engaged now, be it Syria, be it Ukraine, or in case something else will emerge, this future looks pretty bleak. So the very necessity to settle that will be replaced by another logic, that all those conflicts might be used as a way to test each other's ability to react, while still, I hope, the big confrontation, big escalation is impossible. And that's why if we assume that the Cold War spirit is back, then the only area where we can have a more or less productive and fruitful discussion, this is security, how to achieve framework when confrontation and rivalry is not dangerous and has no chances to escalate. To a certain extent, it seems that on both sides, I mean here Russia and the United States, comeback of this spirit was perceived with some kind of enthusiasm, special enthusiasm among certain circles, because the Cold War seems to be very familiar. So we know how to live with this. This is illusion, again, because the current Cold War is different, but still. When I listen to many statements done on the Russian side, when I read conceptual documents issued by Trump administration recently, I see that basically the mindset is pretty similar and close to each other. The idea, which was mentioned in one of earlier sessions, the idea of Trump, this peace through strength, those who master Russian, they would understand how strange it sounds in Russian. Мир через силу means not only this, as in English, but also it means peace, which is, we don't want it, but we need to do something to achieve it. Мир через силу. So actually it's bad, but so it's pretty funny. Of course, again, coming back to this notion of the Cold War, this is misleading because it assumes that Russia-US relationship is still very central. It is central, but not that central as it used to be. And we see all over the globe a very much multilateral setup of relationship, when a Russian-American relationship is actually part of much more complicated framework involving many other actors. I'm afraid that neither Russia nor US, but US especially, doesn't realize this phenomenon properly. Many actors looking at this development from the outside, they basically wait to see what will happen and which dividends they can get from this rivalry between Russia and the United States. Another phenomenon which was not typical for the initial Cold War is, of course, the unprecedented presence of domestic factor in international politics. Whichever country you take, be it Russia, be it China, be it Britain, be it United States, you see that domestic agendas eat up many international issues and prevail, which I think is extremely dangerous, because we see, again, on many fronts, we see how politicians try to use international issues, sometimes extremely important, extremely vital issues, as instruments to address very tactical needs domestically. Again, this is a universal phenomenon. Nowadays, I would say that it's difficult to identify where this phenomenon is more emphasized. Is it Russia or United States? I would say the latter. Then another thing which is, again, different from the previous Cold War is the ongoing fragmentation of international system. We still discuss everything in terms of liberal world order, which was supposed to be universalist, which was supposed to be more or less comprehensive. But I think what we see in many countries, first of all in this country, this is something completely different. This is new cycle beginning. And when United States is proclaiming that America is first, I'm afraid that all the rest have no choice but to do the same. If America is first, then sooner or later China will be first, Russia will be first, and maybe even Europe will be first, or Germany will be first, I don't know. And that leads us to the next specificity of this situation, deformation and change of nature of alliances. We see that alliances today are seen through completely different lens than, say, 40 years ago. NATO has troubles inside which are trying to be addressed by Russian threat, but I'm not sure that Russia will be able to help properly. Russia is not Soviet Union. A relationship between countries which has to work together for some particular reasons in particular situation seems to be more important now than stable relationships. And basically the idea expressed many years ago by then time Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, that mission defense coalition, and at that time he was stormily criticized by everybody. But now we see exactly this happening, and it happens with the Western alliance. It happens also with Russia when we suddenly have much more productive relationship with Turkey in the Middle East, paradoxically, than, for example, with our ally Armenia, which is official ally. At the end of the day, what is to me fatal for any attempts to engage into constructive dialogue, this is a mutual or multilateral feeling of insecurity. And when it comes to Russian-West relationship or Russian-US relationship, there's a mutual feeling of opponent being in decline. And in Russian case, obviously, we hear about declining Russia since quite a while. Partly it's true, partly not. But the new element is that in Russia, in China, in many other countries, there is a spreading idea that the West is declining and the West will never be back to that level of dominance, which used to be normal since actually a couple of centuries. Of course, when you expect your counterpart, your opponent, to decline soon, rationally it's no idea to negotiate. Let's wait when conditions will be better. What will happen in years to come, I think in all countries, be it, so Russia is not at all an exception from that, we will go through pretty profound, dangerous, sensitive transformation based on changes in societies. In the United States, we see it. In Europe, we see it. In Russia, in this regard, I think is absolutely not isolated from those global trends. And if you look closely to Russian development, all trends, including rise of populism, emergence of new particular faces, which are products of rather communication and mass media political reflection than some ideas, rejection of establishment. I think if you put aside Putin, who has his personal relationship with Russian people, then how Russians perceive, say, ministers, governors, members of parliament, bureaucrats, is exactly the same feeling as United States average American vis-a-vis Capitol Hill or average European vis-a-vis Brussels. So this is feeling of being totally at different levels. So the elites establishment lives a life which is absolutely unavailable to normal people. And that means that transformation of political systems is inevitable. I think in this regard, again, Russia, US, Europe, and China are exactly in the same stage. Of course, the way how it will happen will be much different due to obvious reasons. What does it mean for relationship between Russia and US and in general international stability? I think we cannot expect in the middle of this extremely painful process to get to any kind of solutions, not even on the global basis or on the broad international basis, but even on bilateral basis. So it's impossible. When domestic factors are playing such an important role in any decision making, then it's highly unlikely to expect that interest will bring countries together. But what is, of course, common to all of us, this is necessity to try to avoid unnecessary conflicts, which will be catalyzed by this domestic development and high level of irresponsibility and recklessness among all establishments everywhere. So to be cautious, to understand that peace should be achieved, be it through strength or through weakness or through whatever, but peace is really a value which is not given for granted. And in terms of international security, of course, I fully agree with what Professor Rogov said, that nuclear stuff is absolutely crucial. So if we lose this, then nothing has left. So it's very important. And despite skepticism expressed at the previous session, I think cybersecurity is an area where, despite all problems discussed, we should at least start, maybe first on theoretical level, but we need to start a conversation about how to extend principles of strategic stability to that area. Crucial to international stability is domestic stabilization in all important actors. So far, we are not close to this, and I'm afraid that be it here in the United States, with all these turbulences around Trump, be it in Russia, which has entered the stage of inevitable change of political model, or be it in Europe, which is in the deepest crisis since the Second World War, I mean the crisis with European integration, or in China, which is moving towards something new with this indefinite rule of one person. So all of us are so much engaged in domestic troubles that it would be rational at least to try to minimize troubles outside. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Fyodor. And last, our conference organizer, the Kim Marten and Whitney Olin, Professor of Political Science at Barnard, and the Director of the Program on U.S. Russia Relations at the Harriman Institute. Kim.
Thank you. It's very hard to go last at a conference because virtually everything that I would have talked about has already been talked about. So I'm going to try to put it in some kind of coherent framework. But before I do that, I just wanted to say, Sergey, Rogov, I very much appreciated all of the details in your presentation. They're very helpful. But I would point out that in Soviet times, obscure journal articles that were written by retired colonels were sometimes signals of the direction that the state was going. And so there is a reason to pay attention to those journal articles, I think.
The photo pictures of the Lenin's mausoleum were also important.
Kremlinology returns. So what I'm going to try to do is engage in what psychologists would call reframing, taking very difficult issues and trying to work through them. So the argument is that when people face a difficult situation that they can't control, loss of a job, a new physical disability, they basically have two choices. They can be filled with anger and resentment, they can frame it as a loss, they can struggle fruitlessly to try to change a situation they can't control to get back to something that was there before, or they can reframe the situation to see possibilities instead of problems. And so what I want to identify are three problems that our countries, the United States and Russia, currently share, and try very hard to see if there's any chance of a possibility that's located within those problems. So I think the first problem that we share is that presidents in both of our countries do not take advice from experts. I think that this fundamentally makes our situation worse than the era of the Cold War, when experts played a huge role in diplomacy and in arms control. So in Russia, as Fyodor Lukyanov has pointed out, Putin himself made the decision to intervene militarily in Crimea in 2014 in an overnight conversation with several members of his security team. At least that's what Putin tells us. There was apparently no consultation with the foreign ministry or with economic experts in Russia about what the long-term consequences of that would be. In Russia, we know that the foreign ministry is sidelined on most issues. The exception might be in bilateral relations with some Middle Eastern countries, but basically nobody's paying attention to the foreign ministry, and so it may not matter very much whether Sergey Lavrov stays or goes. Dmitry Trenin of the Moscow Carnegie Center a couple of years ago said publicly that think tanks today have no role in Russia, that nobody at the top is paying attention to them. They get all their information from secret sources, and all of their decision-making is secret. Well, I would argue that in the US, we're now facing a rather similar situation. President Trump humiliates and changes his advisors at a dizzying pace. The State Department has been decimated by the policies of the past year and a half. Often, Trump does not follow the advice that has been given to him by the National Security Council, for example, congratulating Putin for his electoral victory against their written advice, and the argument is that he may not have read the written advice that they gave him. But I think, Sergey, this gives us some chance of hope, because maybe he won't listen to John Bolton either. And then finally, we are, of course, dealing with the Never Trump movement of people who just made it clear they didn't want to serve with Trump. Many of the experts within the Republican base decided that they didn't want to work with him, and so experts are being sidelined on both sides. And this leads to a real problem, which is that deep analysis, as in the kind that we have heard at this conference today, may have absolutely no chance of getting to top levels. So how do we see a possibility in this terrible problem? Well, maybe rather than relying on top-level summits, we might concentrate on possibilities of getting lower-level experts, including military officers, together from both governments to exchange information and perspectives. And that's been a theme throughout the conversation today. Now, Keir Giles told us in the last panel that he thought that there were not a lot of very common interests between Russia and the United States where these kinds of discussions could make sense, and we shouldn't just have dialogue to have dialogue. But I would argue that a very important reason for having these kinds of discussions is that by getting to understand each other's perspectives, we have a much greater chance when a crisis situation arises, and it may be a when instead of an if, of finding the signals through the noise, especially in that situation of confrontation. It also provides each sense with a better sense of how to send signals of intent and how to try to ameliorate the concerns of both sides, that their signals will be properly interpreted by the other side. And I think that was a major theme of the last panel, particularly by Erica Borghardt and by Peter Clement. We usually think about the lack of executive control over bureaucratic decision-making as being a bad thing, right? We have this whole subfield of international politics that looks at how terrible it is when bureaucratic politics take over, and that means that the policies that are decided at the executive level don't actually get implemented properly. I want to suggest in a situation where the executives are not listening to the experts, that it might actually provide an opportunity. If lower-level actors have knowledge of each other's perspectives and signaling behavior, that means that they might be able to creatively interpret executive decisions in a way that actually lowers the risk of crisis escalation. And so I just want to throw that out there as a rather controversial statement. Second major problem that I think both sides share is reckless risk-taking. Now, I would say that it's not yet as bad as the Cold War era, and I would just remind everybody that when we talk about the Cold War, we're not primarily talking about the SALT negotiations, which is what we've been talking about today. We had 2 Berlin crises, the horribly deadly Korean War and Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and several Arab-Israeli wars, all which were arguably the result of reckless risk-taking by one side or the other, and all of which involved a superpower standoff of one kind or another, and many of which had the real possibility of escalating to a nuclear confrontation, and we're not quite that badly off yet. Sergey Rogov, I have to say, frightened me incredibly by saying that incoming strikes would receive a simultaneous response from Russia, because we do know that during the Cold War, several times, there were what were perceived to be incoming strikes by each side that turned out to be a misperception. And so if that really is the Russian nuclear posture today, that if they believe that there's an incoming strike, they will simultaneously strike back, that's scary as all hell. What are some examples of recklessness by both sides? Recklessness by President Trump. His tweets, we all know about that. His sudden decisions that most experts at a bipartisan level do not approve of, such as the recent sanctions on steel and aluminum and now the launching of a trade war with China. His whims of hiring people who are not qualified for the positions that they're given and then undercutting and firing people that he has hired. And I would argue that all of the zigzagging that's coming out of the Trump administration really undermines US credibility. And that means that when we're thinking about summit meetings and we're thinking about ways of resolving the arms race at any kind of a high level, why would anyone ever trust that the United States under President Trump would actually follow through on what they said that they were going to do? Because he has this tendency to change his mind every day. However, there is a positive aspect to this, because amidst all of this, the actions that the US military have taken, especially in regard to Russia, have been much more measured. And just a couple of examples to remind everybody of. That was the airstrike on the Syrian airfield that occurred in April 2017, seemed intentionally designed to avoid Russian targets. That was a sense of the US military really exercising restraint. And most recently, in eastern Syria, in the confrontation that occurred at the Kurdish military base that US Special Operations Forces were located at, the US used the deconfliction line extensively to give Russia a warning that there were going to be strikes coming from the US side and time to withdraw those forces if they were in fact participating in the attack. And an investigative reporter for Der Spiegel indicates that, in fact, the Russian mercenaries who were hit by that strike may not have been part of the offensive and may have been there by accident in a way that was left over from an approved agreement that had been part of the original deconfliction line agreements. So I don't think we have enough information for sure to know that that is what happened. I want to thank Peter Clement for bringing that article to my attention. But in fact, this may be a misunderstanding that got resolved in a very positive way because of the restraint that was exercised by both sides. What about on the US, on the Russian side? Well, I think when we see President Putin and his military, we see much more reckless risk-taking. So we already mentioned the lack of long-term thinking about the meaning of the overall move into Crimea, thinking about Kremnash and the immediate benefits that it would have without thinking about the long-term strategic costs. I think it's also true in eastern Ukraine. I think President Putin didn't anticipate the possibility, for example, that poor command and control in relation to the rebels operating in Luhansk would lead to the shooting down of the MH17 civilian jetliner. The Dutch investigators are still continuing their research, but the most credible evidence that's been presented recently by Bellingcat is that the decision to shoot the plane down involved a combination of rebels in Luhansk who were being advised by a Russian Colonel General, Alexander Tkachov, who was officially in retirement and working in the military inspectorate. And that means that there's a possibility, at least, even though we don't know this for sure, that blurred or informal command structure may have played a role in poor decision-making in that case, which had obviously terrible strategic consequences because that was the major cause of European unity on sanctions ever since. I think it's similarly been true for Russia in Syria in terms of the coordination with mercenary forces. We now know that the purpose of those mercenary forces from their own perspective is to get paid for seizing oil infrastructure and taking it back on behalf of the Syrian regime. And I think that that opens up Russia to some real problems in command and control going forward. We also have the problem of chemical weapons use by the Syrian regime, that Russia supports the regime and therefore finds itself globally isolated in the United Nations because it cannot control the decisions that are made by its Syrian ally. And I think, although we don't have the clear information here, but I think there is evidence that a lack of clear command and control might be playing a role in the nerve agent poisoning of Sergei Skripal, whether it was ordered by the Russian state or carried out by a rogue Russian intelligence officer. Either the Kremlin engaged in reckless risk-taking or it failed to prevent someone else from engaging in reckless risk-taking. Dangerous military incidents have been happening frequently over the last several years. The most obvious one was the one that led Turkey to shoot down a Russian military jet at the border with Syria in November 2015. But this follows a long pattern of Russian Air Force testing of borders and of both air and naval dangerous military activities at a high speed and too close to NATO borders and NATO vessels. Now, what's really interesting is that a student in my Russia and the West class last year, whose name is Alan Griffith, wrote a paper showing that the vast majority of Russian incursions into the airspace over Estonia and Finland in the Baltics, 22 out of 32 of those reported incursions, could have been done merely to decrease the flight time into St. Petersburg over little pieces of the territory that stuck out inconveniently into international territory, including actions that were taken in inclement weather, which means that it might be sloppiness on the part of the Russian pilots rather than hostile intention by the Russian state. And that actually fits with U.S. military officers' frequent claim that some of the dangerous military activities carried out by Russian forces reflect a lack of discipline rather than truly hostile intent that is coming from the Russian state as a message to the U.S. side. So when we see this reckless risk-taking by both sides, it's kind of hard to find a positive situation, except that what we might hope is that as those at lower levels especially come to realize the consequences of their recklessness, as more and more of the consequences of these reckless incidents pile up, there may be a door opening to what we might call track 1.5 negotiations, especially between lower level military officers, to talk once again about signaling, which keeps on coming up as a real theme in this conference. Now, all military-to-military conversations below the very senior level have been discontinued by the U.S. side as one of what they consider the sanctions as a result of the intervention in Ukraine. The U.S. Senate has inserted language in the appropriations laws every year since 2015 that prohibits the State Department from allocating funds to pay for military-to-military activities. So the Syria deconfliction line is a real exception there. It doesn't go through the State Department. But at the same time, we have to realize that it's unfortunate that there was not very much Russian interest in participating in these conversations, even when they were available before 2015. And more recently, as Keir Giles pointed out, the Russian side did not want to encourage military observers at the large-scale Zapad 17 military exercises last year, even though it was clear that part of the purpose of the exercises was to give a signal to international observers about what Russian capabilities and intentions were. So the reason why this military issue means so much to me is that in 1990, when I was a graduate student at Stanford, I was the rapporteur for a conference at the Center for International Security and Arms Control at Stanford that was a follow-up to the 1989 Dangerous Military Activities Agreement that was reached between U.S. and Soviet military officers. And what was really interesting for me being a part of this conference was how the U.S. and Soviet military officers were able, at a time that the Cold War still existed, it was winding down, but 1990 was not definitely a situation where it was clear what direction things were going to go. They found a remarkable degree of being able to understand each other because of their similar training as military officers. And Bill Perry, who is now age 90, was one of the people who really was responsible for putting those conferences together. He's a former Secretary of Defense, and he has been advocating the resumption of military-to-military talks on both sides. So my sense is it's wrong of the U.S. Senate to think of this as being a sanction against Russia. It doesn't harm Russia as an individual actor not to have these agreements. It's also wrong of the Russian side to think of military-to-military activities as a Western effort to infiltrate and undermine and sabotage the Russian military, which has been the traditional Russian view. We have to find a way to get over those perceptions so that discussions can happen in a way that each side can have a better perception of communicating to each other how they see signals and how they communicate signals. Final problem, lack of trust between the U.S. and Russia. I would just point out that this was completely true of the Cold War, too. We got cooperation in spite of distrust, even though each side fully planned to do whatever was needed to win a nuclear war if it was fought, and thereby to try to maintain superiority. Bob Legvold, who's been mentioned already, an emeritus professor at Columbia and a true leader in the effort to enhance understanding, mentioned at our first conference in this program in the fall of 2014 that the Soviet side had been very disappointed and offended by the volume of Henry Kissinger's memoirs that was published in 1982 called The Years of Upheaval, where Kissinger described his true thinking about what détente meant. So I went back and read what Kissinger said, and Kissinger said three things about his view of détente. That eventually the Soviet system would be defeated because of its economic weaknesses and ideological bankruptcy, and the U.S. just had to hold on. That the U.S. gained incredible military advantages from the SALT arms limitations because it gave them time to build the new Trident submarine systems and to put a slight stop, at least, to the Soviets building up new multiple warhead systems that put the U.S. counterforce deterrent at threat. And he also pointed out that in 1967, before any kind of anti-ballistic missile system program existed, President Johnson of the United States had suggested to Soviet Premier Kosygin that both sides renounce ABMs. Kosygin at that time contemptuously said that was one of the most ridiculous ideas that he'd ever seen. But by 1970, when the Nixon administration had won the congressional battle to go ahead with funding of an ABM system, all of a sudden Soviet SALT negotiators didn't want to talk about anything else. So what are the possibilities in this problem of distrust? The SALT and ABM treaty processes worked, at least to a limited degree, even though each side planned to win a nuclear war if it was fought. And even if President Trump doesn't listen to many experts today, we do know that he meets frequently with Henry Kissinger, and that Kissinger travels frequently to Moscow to have high-level meetings there, so maybe there is a possibility that comes from that Cold War experience. But despite Kissinger's cynicism, a major U.S. purpose of the SALT negotiations was to share the U.S. logic of thinking about strategic nuclear stability and instability with their Russian counterparts. It was important, especially in an era when the Soviet military had a monopoly on military technical information inside the Soviet Union, and civilian Communist Party leaders didn't have much internal knowledge. And I would argue that, therefore, we should look at all of these processes of negotiation and discussion, not primarily even as a way of reaching agreement, but a way of sharing our thinking about strategic stability, especially in an era of new weapons technology, both in nuclear issues, but especially in cyber issues. In all the current talk of an arms race and a cyber race, if both sides credibly threaten to build up their capabilities, it may be a way of convincing each side that it's in their interest to negotiate, which was a theme that was also raised earlier today. And so we've seen much hand-wringing on the US side over Russia demonstrating that it has the cyber capability to hold US infrastructure at risk. But I would just point out to everybody that that's exactly what mutual assured destruction was about in the old days, holding each other's civilian populations at risk. And if we put it in those historical comparative terms, it may not be quite as new and frightening as we are thinking about it. So there may be similarities in logic and a similarity in signals, although we don't know for sure how to interpret those signals. So my overall conclusion is we can't wish away the very real problems and dangers in the U.S.-Russia security relationship today. There's a lack of room for expert advice on both sides. There's reckless risk-taking happening on both sides, and there's a lack of trust on both sides that's unlikely to be overcome anytime soon. But we can still work on trying to locate possibilities within this problem set. And I hope our conference today has been one small step in the process of information exchange that might help each side better send and receive comprehensible and credible signals. And as the ancient Greeks and Romans recognized, dripping water hollows out a stone. We can't expect deep change anytime soon, but we can persist in trying to locate small possibilities that may pay off eventually.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you to all the panelists for those just outstanding presentations. I mean, I find this very skilled use of Cold War era analogies and processes and application today potentially very productive. And I actually got 3 out of, I mean, there were many more were given, but just some main ones that I took from the panel. You know, Sergey's talking about the domestic political climate here, right? The impossibility of actually being able to ratify a treaty given the nature of the political system. And I think that's even actually worse given, I think, some of the sort of anti-Russia kind of sentiments now on the Democratic side, right? I mean, there is like very little political incentive now, right, to be conciliatory on Russia, right? In any kind of vote, no matter what you say, you just vote no, right? 98-2, as we saw with sanctions. So I would actually say it's even worse. Fyodor, your point about declining powers, I think this is really important. And it's not just, we've talked in some other contexts with Kim about the perception of mutual exceptionalism, right? And this is sort of one of our issues. But I think this, you know, regarding each other as declining powers also changes timelines of strategic calculations, right? And it forces you in a different mode about when things have to happen and their urgency. And so I think that's a real takeaway that I think is important. It's important for expert communities to consider. And then I think Kim's point about you know, disregard of expertise is absolutely vital, right? One of the lessons of the Cold War was establishing these transnational networks of expert communities that then forged relationships and sort of took them all the way up, as well as her point about the fragmentation of the U.S. foreign policy and security policy bureaucracy and the credibility issue, right? When was the last time the U.S. faced such a severe credibility issues in terms of its international agreements? We have entire reams of American international relations theory that talks about the credibility of democracies, right? Because we're able to institutionalize trade agreements and arms control and so forth. So in some ways, I think it's even more volatile than it was before. But you know, perhaps what I get from all of you in your, and again, your wonderful interventions is at least we have a kind of a knowledge of what's happened before, and maybe we can actually identify the issues, and so we can sort of work on them. So thank you for that. We do have a little bit of time for questions. So again, invite you to the microphone and let us know again your name for the record and who the question is directed to. Here.
Geir Giles from Conflict Studies Research Center. Sergey Mikhailovich, after your presentation, so many questions, so little time. Let's focus just on the most potentially explosive one. I might not be the only person in the room who'd be interested in fleshing out the distinction between an existential threat and a threat to existence. When you look at the language in the military doctrine, it's «когда поставлено под угрозу самосуществование государства», which doesn't to us say this is a simple case of whenever Russia is invaded, which was the message I got from your description of it. Could you please elucidate a little more what exactly your interpretation of that phrase is and how it would relate to an attack on Kaliningrad as you described?
Nuclear weapons present an existential threat. As long as nuclear weapons exist, there is a possibility of their employment and of a nuclear war, which can result in a terrible catastrophe of the entire mankind. The threat to the existence of state is something else. For instance, the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, was it because of the threat of nuclear weapons or of foreign invasion by NATO armies and Marines, US Marines came to the Red Square? No. But apparently the formula has never been clarified what exactly it could be. So it's open to interpretation. But what is important is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia gave up its no first use pledge, whatever that pledge meant. Nevertheless, that was the Russian official position until 1993. And that reflected much growing reliance on nuclear weapons in a situation when Russian conventional forces almost completely collapsed and disintegrated. Two conditions which Russian doctrine mentions and Putin was speaking about. The first one is related to maintenance of the mutually assured destruction with the United States. And Putin, in his interviews, emphasized that it would be a massive response if there is an attack by nuclear missiles against targets on the Russian territory. Apparently, the second condition, the existence of a threat, relates to the perception that Russia hardly can win a conventional military conflict with NATO, since the disbalance is too great. And here comes the question of the employment of Russian tactical nuclear weapons. On the other hand, look at American nuclear posture, declaratory posture. The United States, as you know, never took a commitment of no first use. And the United States always, in even declaratory documents, demonstrates that the United States can initiate the use of nuclear weapons. And the new nuclear posture review, I think, provides quite a long list of situations where the United States can use nuclear weapons. And Pavel Podvig can correct me if I'm wrong, but even as use of cyber weapons could result in American retaliation with nuclear weapons. So, well, in this sense, the United States, at least on the declaratory level, does not limit itself to any specific narrow scenarios. It's a very wide range. On the other hand, what is the US posture? Launch on warning or launch under attack? There have been conflicting discussions and conflicting views about that among American experts. But I think the dominant view that it's launch on warning, not launch under attack. The United States is not going to wait to absorb the massive nuclear attack, destroying American ICBMs and silos. They will be launched, just as Putin said, they will be launched before they're destroyed.
Daniel Burke with the Schiller Institute again. This is the 35th birthday of the Strategic Defense Initiative announcement by President Reagan in March of 1983, in which he suggested that we could solve the Cold War by working together to develop weaponry, defensive weaponry based on new physical principles, which would make nuclear weapons, thermonuclear weapons, impotent and obsolete. Mr. LaRouche, Lyndon LaRouche, wrote this document.
No.
Yes, I must bring this forward.
No, you must not bring this forward. You are a guest here. You play by our rules.
We need peace through
economic
economic
development. Do you have a
development.
question for the panelists?
Yes. Can we work together to develop the third world, particularly Africa, as part of an agreement between U.S., Russia, and China to prevent thermonuclear war?
Okay, thank you. Yep. Next question.
5 days ago, my name is Valeria. I'm studying psychology at Hunter College. 5 days ago, I watched the interview of Alexei Venediktov, what's his name? Dude. And then he said that Putin took Crimea so he could be in the textbooks because it was very important for him. Okay. In your opinion, what is the main reason why Putin got involved with annexation of Crimea?
Okay, so let's go down the panel, and perhaps you can respond to the questions or respond to each other. Final thoughts. We have about a minute each. So let's start with start with Fyodor, and then we'll go to Sergey and then Kim.
Okay, maybe I answer the question. First of all, I don't think that you need to take Alexei Venediktov's word as final wisdom. He's a very talented journalist. That's it. Seriously, I think the whole story about Crimea was, of course, it will be in textbooks in many regards, but one of reasons why it should be there, just to reconstruct why it happened. And of course, Crimea was not the beginning of the story. It was a result of very long development, and I would refer to an excellent book published last year by CSIS, by Tim Colton and Sam Charap about how we got there. I think one of the best descriptions, very unbiased and so. No one knows, and Putin, as Kim rightly pointed out, Putin himself said that that was basically his decision, and his press secretary, Mr. Peskov, said maybe 2 months after, publicly in interview, that that was decision made by the president himself, and all the rest learned it after. So in this regard, of course, we cannot read in his mind completely, but I think I'm pretty sure that the main motivation was, of course, a strategic one. He thought about Black Sea Fleet. That was common wisdom in Russia at that time, that in case development in Ukraine would continue as it happened, as it started, then the Black Sea Fleet will be kicked out immediately or very soon, and the American fleet will come there immediately after. So rightly or wrongly, but that was a belief, and it's still there. So I think strategic consideration was the main one. The problem came later, because to me, when Putin, for some reasons, maybe domestic ones, decided to add another explanation in his famous Crimean speech, he added this Russian world narrative, national romanticism, and that was much worse. And the problem was that I'm sure that initially it was not part of his consideration. He added that later, and that provoked a lot of problems afterwards.
It's claimed that Russians are great chess players, but Russia didn't have a world champion in chess for many, many years. Actually, I lived in Crimea with my grandparents in 1954 when Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine. And it was considered to be a joke, because nobody could expect what would happen later. Now about ballistic missile defenses. Many ideas about strategic stability were first developed in the United States. And it took some time for Russian military thinkers and policymakers to absorb those ideas of strategic stability. I do remember well this debate which started after the Glassboro summit of 1967, and how crazy American idea to limit it used to be called ABM at the time, now it's called BMD, fashions change. It was not Russia, but the United States which announced that the ABM Treaty is the founding stone of strategic stability. That was the formula. We had some problems to translate. Finally, we invented краеугольный камень стратегической стабильности, the founding stone. And definitely, that helped to stop the unlimited growth of the offensive nuclear arsenals. But that also permitted, well, the SALT and the ABM Treaty permitted continuation of nuclear arms race according to the principle, what is not prohibited is allowed. And actually Kissinger, I know Kissinger a little bit, and I know what he was doing in those days. He is guilty of preventing the Soviet Union and the United States in 1972, as we were suggesting, to ban MIRVs, multiply independent re-entry vehicles. If it were done, then the strategic nuclear arms race would stop. Instead, the United States made a great jump forward, but then they found out that because the Soviets had the heavy missiles, we could deploy many more MIRVs than the United States. And when Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, nobody in the Soviet Union seriously believed his idea that he would share the technology with Moscow. But that idea was very soon forgotten in the United States. And the Ross-Mamedov discussions in 1992 were really absolutely unproductive. And when George W. Bush decided to withdraw from the ABM Treaty, that was really a turning point for the Russian perception of the United States. It was the United States which was preaching to us, well, we believe you nice guys, but we believe much more in legally binding treaties. And when the United States decided to unilaterally withdraw from the ABM Treaty, for no rational reasons at all as far as Russia is concerned, and even today the United States has a smaller number of strategic interceptors than was permitted by the ABM Treaty. That really was a very serious blow to the mutual trust between Russia and the United States. And George W. Bush still spoke about some cooperative effort in ballistic missile defenses, but Obama never did it, and of course Trump never will do. So this idea is dead and buried.
Thank you. Kim?
Just one small comment on the ABM treaty. I agree with Sergey that it was probably the worst mistake that the U.S. made, not because I necessarily agree with him that it was a bad idea in terms of the technical things that it allowed in a changing world situation, but because I think underlying whatever Putin's personal psychology may be, there is a real sense that was mentioned in earlier panels today that the thing that is driving Russian foreign policy behavior is a search for status and wanting to be taken seriously and wanting to have its concerns taken into account. And so the problem was not that the U.S. decided that the ABM treaty no longer made sense. It was that it abrogated it so quickly and with such a low level of discussion over time with its Russian counterparts. And I think that if it had taken Russian concerns more seriously, at that time there still was a possibility that something could have been worked out that would have served the interests of both sides. So I'll just leave it there.
But John Bolton was speaking about it many years before the withdrawal from the ABM treaty.
Well, that doesn't give us much hope for the future.
And on that note, I want to say a couple of just words here on behalf of the Institute, because, you know, I think the Harriman Institute itself was so bound in a lot of these discussions, a lot of these fora that we've talked about in the Cold War. And of course, now 25 years later, the academy itself is very different. We have all sorts of different fields. We have different professional schools, lots of different concerns regarding Russia. But we see the value of having dialogues about these types of issues. And so I really want to thank my colleague Kim Marten, who had this vision for creating a program specifically dedicated to U.S. Russia relations that would really enshrine the central historical mission of Harriman as a core part of what it does. And so I'm so pleased that, given all of her other leadership obligations over the next 3 years, she's going to remain director of the program, she's going to remain engaged with it, and it's going to be a central part of what we do here. So I want, on behalf of Harriman, I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank the panelists for coming in, and I'd like to give the mic to Kim to close our conference.
And thank you, Alex, for those very kind words. And I just want to close by thanking the Harriman staff for everything that they did to make this possible, and the students who have been helping the Harriman staff, with a special note of thanks to both Carly Jackson and Alla Rogov, who did heroic duties in the face of all kinds of problems, especially that were associated with travel difficulties due to the snowstorm a couple of days ago. So we really rely on you to do everything, and we are so grateful for all the work you do, and we operate as a team, and we're grateful to our team members.
Thank you.